The morning light of Velthora Prime's twin suns cast an ethereal glow across the crystal spires of the capital city, their prismatic surfaces refracting rainbows that danced through the peaceful streets below. Ambassador Keithara Vel stood at the observation deck of the High Council chamber, her azure skin shimmering with the stress patterns that betrayed her inner turmoil despite her composed exterior. For 3 millennia, her people had maintained perfect neutrality, serving as the galaxy's mediators and healers. Today, that proud tradition would end. The outer colonies have gone silent, reported Councillor Mindar Kess, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom. Herrick 7, New Veltha, the research stations on Kithros, all dark. The Vorthon advances faster than our worst projections. Vel's 4-fingered hands traced the ancient patterns on the ceremonial podium, seeking comfort in traditions that might not survive the coming days. Through the vast transparasteel windows, she could see civilian transports ascending toward the orbital stations, families clutching their few possessions as they fled their homeworld. The sight made her chest constrict with a pain that transcended mere physical discomfort. How long until they reach the core systems? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. 72 standard hours, perhaps less if they don't pause to process the populations they encounter. Kess's euphemism fooled no one. The Vorthons didn't take prisoners. They took slaves, stripping conquered worlds of their resources and peoples with mechanical efficiency. The emergency session had been called after the arrival of the last refugee ship from the outer territories. The survivors spoke of Vorthon battle groups that blotted out stars, of orbital bombardments that turned paradise worlds into smoking wastelands, of entire species loaded into cargo holds like livestock. The Galactic Council had offered their usual platitudes and empty promises. The neighboring systems had closed their borders, terrified of drawing Vorthon attention. The great powers spoke of economic sanctions and diplomatic protests, while Kitherian colonies burned. "We have one final option," Vel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The chamber fell silent except for the soft harmonics of the crystal formations that gave their architecture its distinctive song. "We can invoke Article 7 of the Galactic Assistance Compact." The silence stretched longer, broken only by Councillor Rathvek Moore's sharp intake of breath. "A species-wide distress call? Ambassador, our people haven't asked for military aid since the time of emergence. It goes against everything we represent." "Everything we represent will cease to exist in 3 days," Vel replied, turning from the window to face the assembled council. Her stress patterns had shifted to the deep crimson of desperate resolve. "The Vorthons have made their intentions clear. They don't want our worlds or our resources. They want us. Our medical knowledge, our diplomatic skills, our longevity. They want us as permanent servants to their empire." She activated the holographic display that dominated the chamber's center, showing the inexorable advance of Vorthon forces across their spiral arm of the galaxy. Red markers indicated conquered systems, yellow showed systems under siege, and the small cluster of blue representing Kitherian space grew smaller with each update. The Altarians sent sympathetic words and 3 patrol ships. The Zenith Collective offered refugee status for our essential personnel, a handful of our brightest minds, while the rest face enslavement. The hegemony closed their borders entirely. Vel's voice grew stronger with each word, her natural diplomat's cadence taking on an edge that few had ever heard. "But there is one species that has never failed to respond to calls for assistance." "The humans," breathed Councillor Mindar. "You're suggesting we call upon the humans." The chamber erupted in debate. Voices rose in a dozen different pitches and tones, the musical quality of Kitherian speech creating a chaotic symphony. Some argued that humans were too unpredictable, too violent, too young a species to trust with their survival. Others pointed out that human response to distress calls had become legendary across known space, sometimes problematically so. Vel raised her hand for silence, and ancient respect for her office eventually restored order. "I've studied every human intervention in the past 2 centuries, she said, her words measured and precise. The siege of craft world Ultanash. The humans sent 14 fleets to break a blockade when the Eldar requested assistance. The Tyranid incursion at Margrave's world. 37 battle groups responded to protect a mining colony they'd never heard of. The rescue of the Tau expedition beyond the Galactic Rim. They also have a tendency toward excess, interrupted Counselor Rathvek. Remember the Orc pacification of Sector Grimhold? The humans turned a police action into a 40-year crusade, which eliminated the Orc threat from that entire region, Vel countered. Perhaps excess is what we need. The Vorthons respect only strength, and they've calculated that we possess none. They haven't calculated human involvement. The debate continued for another hour, but the outcome was inevitable. As reports arrived of Vorthon scouts probing the outer sensor nets of their home system, the Council voted by the narrowest possible margin to authorize a general distress call under Article 7. Vel moved to the communications array, her hands trembling slightly as she began encoding the signal that would announce to the galaxy that the Catherians, after 3,000 years of proud independence, were asking for help. The message was broadcast on all emergency frequencies, transmitted through subspace relays to every major system within 500 light years. Most of the galaxy's powers would receive the message within hours. The Galactic Council would convene, emergency sessions, debate endlessly, and ultimately offer too little, too late. The regional powers would calculate the cost of intervention against the risk of Vorthon retaliation and find their courage wanting. But on a blue-green world at the galaxy's edge, in a solar system the Vorthons considered too remote and primitive to concern themselves with, the message reached very different ears. Admiral Yoon Jae-sung stood in the command center of Luna Base, watching the automated translation systems process the Catherian distress call. Around him, duty officers maintained their stations with professional calm, but he could sense the tension building like pressure before a storm. The Admiral's weathered face, marked by decades of void warfare, remained impassive as he absorbed the details of the Vorthon advance. "Sir," his aide Commander Lee Tae-ho approached with a datapad. "Intelligence estimates the Vorthon force at approximately 4,000 combat vessels. They've committed roughly 60% of their total fleet to this operation." "And our assessment of Catherian defensive capabilities?" "Minimal, sir. They've got maybe 300 patrol ships, most designed for customs enforcement rather than fleet combat. Their orbital platforms are primarily medical and research facilities. They're completely outclassed." Yoon nodded slowly, his mind already racing through tactical possibilities. The Catherians had been neutral for so long that most species had forgotten they possessed any military assets at all. The Vorthons saw them as prey, nothing more. "What's the status of the home fleet?" he asked. Lee consulted his pad again. "All vessels are currently in system, sir. We've been running the quarterly exercises, so combat readiness is at peak efficiency. Admiral Park commands the first battle group. Admiral Kim has the second, and—" "All of them, Commander," Yoon interrupted quietly. "What's the status of all home fleet assets?" Lee's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of careful precision. 12,437 vessels, sir. From scouts to dreadnoughts, full combat loads, crews, at standard readiness. We could have the entire fleet ready for hyperspace translation within 18 hours. The command center had grown quiet around them, conversations trailing off as officers strained to hear their exchange. Yoon was aware of the attention, aware that his next words would ripple through the human military structure like a shockwave. "Prep them all," he said simply. "Sir?" Lee's composure finally cracked slightly. "All of them? The entire home fleet?" "The Catherians asked for help, Commander. We're going to help them." As alarms began to sound across Luna Base and emergency action messages flashed to every human naval facility in the system, Admiral Yoon returned his attention to the tactical display. The Vorthon advance looked unstoppable, a crimson tide washing across the galactic map toward the small blue cluster of Catherian space. They had no idea what was coming. The Vorthon Supreme Commander Kralthax stood on the bridge of his flagship Subjugator's Wrath, watching the tactical displays with predatory satisfaction. His segmented carapace gleamed under the harsh lighting, each piece of his natural armor bearing the ritual scars of a dozen conquered worlds. The approaching Catherian system spread before him like a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Status report, he commanded, his voice carrying the clicking undertones that marked his species' aggression displays. Advanced scouts report minimal resistance, Supreme Commander, replied his tactical officer. The Catherians have pulled their remaining patrol vessels back to their homeworld. They appear to be establishing a defensive perimeter around Velthara Prime, though their formations are inadequate. Kralthax's mandibles clicked in amusement. 300 patrol boats against 4,000 Vorthan warships. The mathematics were so absurd they bordered on insulting. Still, he appreciated enemies who knew when they were beaten, even if they insisted on playing out the charade of resistance. Any response to their distress call? He asked, though he already knew the answer. The Galactic Council would debate for months before reaching a decision, and by then the Catherians would be processing medical supplies in Vorthan labor facilities. The usual meaningless gestures, Supreme Commander. The Altarians sent a token force of 12 vessels, currently maintaining position at the system's edge and requesting negotiations. The hegemony transmitted condemnation of our actions. The Council has called for an emergency session. And the humans? The question seemed to amuse his bridge crew, their carapaces shifting to display patterns of contempt. No response detected, Supreme Commander. Intelligence suggests they consider this sector too remote for their interests. Kralthax nodded, approvingly. Humans were notorious for their unpredictable responses to galactic crises, but even they wouldn't waste resources on a lost cause this far from their territory. The Catherians had chosen their neutrality poorly, too far from potential allies, too weak to matter to the great powers. Begin the final approach, he ordered. Signal the fleet to adopt bombardment formations. I want this concluded within 6 standard hours. As the Vorthan armada surged forward, Ambassador Vel stood in the emergency command center deep beneath Velthara Prime's surface. The chamber hummed with desperate activity as her people coordinated their hopeless defense. Sensor displays showed the approaching storm of Vorthan vessels, their formation so vast it registered as a single massive contact on long-range scanners. Any word from the refugee transports? She asked Captain Silnor Kev, the highest-ranking military officer left in their depleted forces. The last civilian ships cleared the outer system 20 minutes ago, he reported, his stress patterns showing the deep blue of resigned courage. Whatever happens here, at least some of our people will survive. Vel nodded, though survival as refugees scattered across hostile space hardly seemed like victory. She moved to the communications console, hoping against hope for some sign that their desperate gamble had paid off. The subspace channels crackled with routine traffic, diplomatic protests, and the coordinated chatter of the approaching Vorthan fleet. Then the sensors screamed. "Contact!" shouted sensor operator Milda Rex, her 4 eyes wide with disbelief. Multiple contacts translating from hyperspace at grid reference 77 Alpha. The main display shifted to show the emergent signatures, and the chamber fell silent. One by one, ship after ship materialized from the swirling vortex of hyperspace, their hulls gleaming with the distinctive angular lines of human construction, but this wasn't the small relief force they had dared to hope for. "How many?" Vel whispered. Milda's hands danced across her console, her expression shifting from confusion to awe, to something approaching terror. I can't get an accurate count. The computer keeps recalculating. It's showing over 8,000 contacts and still climbing." "That's impossible," Captain Kev breathed. "No species deploys fleets that large for foreign interventions." But the sensors didn't lie. Wave after wave of human warships continued to translate into normal space, their formations spreading across the system like a metallic constellation. Massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the Catherian or Vorthan navies, sleek cruisers bristling with weapon systems, clouds of destroyers and frigates moving in perfect coordination. "Final count," Milda announced, her voice barely steady. 12,437 vessels. Fleet Admiral-class command ship detected. They're broadcasting on all frequencies. The communications array filled with a calm, measured voice, speaking accented but clear Galactic standard. "This is Fleet Admiral Choi Hyunwoo of the Human Defense Force commanding the Solholm Fleet. To all Cytherian forces, maintain position and stand by for coordination protocols. To all Vorthan forces. The voice paused, and somehow that silence carried more menace than any threat. You have 30 minutes to begin withdrawal from this system. Aboard the subjugator's wrath, chaos had replaced confidence. Kralthax stared at the tactical display in stunned disbelief as contact markers filled every screen. His bridge crew scurried between stations, trying to make sense of readings that shouldn't have been possible. Are these readings accurate? He demanded. Confirmed and triple-checked, Supreme Commander, his sensor chief replied, his stress patterns showing complete bewilderment. The humans have deployed a fleet larger than our entire Imperial Navy. Our intelligence estimates were insufficient. Kralthax felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest: uncertainty. The Vorthan Empire had built its reputation on overwhelming force and calculated brutality. They had never faced an enemy willing to commit such massive resources to defend strangers. What do we know about human fleet doctrine? He asked his intelligence officer. Limited data, Supreme Commander. They rarely deploy more than a few hundred ships for foreign operations. This level of commitment is unprecedented. Our tactical analyses assumed human involvement would be minimal. The communication channel crackled to life again, this time carrying a different voice with harder edges. Vorthan Fleet, this is Admiral Lee Tae-ho aboard the battleship Soul's Pride. Your 30 minutes has become 29. I suggest you use them wisely. Kralthax's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation his crew recognized with growing alarm. Signal the Hegemony Command. Request immediate tactical intelligence on human fleet capabilities. Minutes passed before the response arrived, and it brought no comfort. Supreme Command advises extreme caution. Human naval doctrine emphasizes overwhelming response to defensive operations. Recommend diplomatic resolution. The Supreme Commander's carapace shifted to display patterns of rage. The Hegemony, their nominal allies, were already abandoning them. But retreat would mean disgrace, the end of his clan's honor, possibly his execution by the Imperial Council. Supreme Commander, his communications officer interrupted. The human admiral is requesting direct communication. Kralthax straightened, his natural armor plates clicking into formal position. Open the channel. The main screen filled with the image of a human face, older, weathered, with the calm eyes of someone accustomed to command. Fleet Admiral Choi spoke with the same measured tone as before, but now Kralthax could see the steel beneath the diplomacy. Supreme Commander Kralthax, the human began, somehow pronouncing the Vorthan name correctly, despite its clicking consonants. I am Fleet Admiral Choi Hyun-woo. I believe you received our previous message. Your show of force is impressive, Admiral, Kralthax replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. But this is an internal matter. The Cytherians initiated hostilities. They called for help, Choi interrupted, his tone never changing. We answered. That's all the justification we require. You would risk war between our species over these healers and diplomats? The human admiral's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes seemed to harden. Supreme Commander, let me be very clear. The Cytherians asked humanity for help. Not the Earth government, not our military command, not our politicians. They asked humanity. Do you understand the difference? Kralthax didn't, and his confusion must have shown. When someone asks humanity for help, Choi continued, we don't send what we think might be enough. We don't calculate minimum viable responses or acceptable loss ratios. We send everything we have, because that's what you do when someone needs help. The channel closed, leaving the Vorthan bridge in tense silence. Around them, the human fleet continued its deployment, forming defensive shells around Cytherian positions with mathematical precision. Smaller ships broke off to establish patrol routes, while the massive capital ships took position in a formation Kralthax recognized with growing dread. Not defensive, but pre-assault. Your orders, Supreme Commander? His tactical officer asked, quietly. Kralthax stared at the display, watching 12,000 human warships arrange themselves like pieces on a game board. His 4,000 vessels, which had seemed unstoppable hours before, now appeared woefully inadequate. Signal the fleet, he said finally. Maintain position and await further orders. For the first time in his career, the Supreme Commander of a Vorthan war fleet had no idea what to do next. The 30-minute ultimatum expired with the silence of space itself. Supreme Commander Kralthax had chosen defiance over retreat, though the decision sat in his throat like swallowed glass. The Imperial Council would execute him for cowardice. If he withdrew without a shot fired, but facing 12,000 human warships felt increasingly like elaborate suicide. His tactical displays showed the human fleet maintaining perfect formation, their weapons powered but not yet locked onto targets. All ships report ready, Supreme Commander, his weapons officer announced, though the clicking undertone of his voice betrayed his nervousness. The humans haven't moved from defensive positions. Kralthax studied the holographic battlefield one final time. Perhaps the humans were bluffing. Perhaps their massive fleet was for show, designed to intimidate, rather than fight. His species had built an empire on the principle that everyone had their breaking point, and no rational commander would risk such massive losses for strangers. Signal the fleet, he commanded. Begin the assault. Target the human capital ships. First, break their command structure and the rest will scatter. The Vorthan armada surged forward in a formation perfected through 100 conquests. Their ships moved like a school of metallic predators, sleek hulls bristling with plasma, cannons and torpedo launchers. 4,000 vessels against 12,000 seemed impossible odds. But the Vorthans had superior technology, decades of combat experience, and the desperate fury of warriors with no retreat. Aboard the human flagship Incheon's Wrath fleet, Admiral Choi Hyunwoo watched the Vorthan advance with the calm attention of a master craftsman, observing his tools. The massive command ship's bridge hummed with quiet efficiency as hundreds of officers coordinated the largest fleet action in human history. Enemy fleet has committed to attack Vector 77 Alpha, reported Captain Park So-jin from her tactical station. Estimated contact in 12 minutes at current acceleration. Signal from Admiral Lee aboard Seoul's Pride, Communications Officer Nam Da-yoon announced. First battle group reports ready. Admiral Kim's second group has flanking position. Admiral Huang confirms third group positioned at enemy's projected exit vectors. Choi nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. And our friends? Catherian. Vessels maintaining safe distance as instructed, sir. Ambassador Vell has expressed concern about our tactical deployment. The fleet admiral's mouth quirked upward slightly. The Catherians, peaceful by nature and inexperienced in warfare, couldn't understand why the humans weren't forming traditional defensive lines. Instead, the human fleet had scattered across the system in what appeared to be random clusters, leaving obvious gaps in their formation. Communications, open a channel to all ships, Choi commanded. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute authority. All vessels, this is Admiral Choi. Today we fight not for territory or resources, but for the principle that no one who asks for help should face extinction alone. The Vorthans believe strength comes from conquest. Show them that strength comes from standing together. All ships, weapons free. Execute Operation Thunderstorm. The human fleet transformed. What had appeared to be scattered defensive positions revealed themselves as carefully coordinated attack formations. The gaps in human lines became kill zones as ships that had seemed randomly placed suddenly moved with mathematical precision. Admiral Lee's first battle group accelerated directly toward the Vorthan spearhead, while Admiral Kim's forces swept in from the flank, their combined firepower creating a crossfire that turned space itself into a blazing hell. The first exchange of fire illuminated the system like a newborn star. Vorthan plasma beams lanced out in coordinated salvos, their purple energy striking human shields in cascading displays of absorbed power. But the return fire was unlike anything in Kralthax's experience. Human weapons didn't follow traditional patterns. Where Vorthan doctrine emphasized massed energy weapon attacks, human ships fired everything they had. Kinetic projectiles, energy beams, missile swarms, and weapon systems that didn't appear in any galactic database. Captain Oh Min-soo's destroyer, Squadron launched what appeared to be mining charges, crude devices that detonated in precisely calculated patterns to channel the Vorthon advance into overlapping fields of fire. "What are they doing?" Kralthax demanded as his tactical display devolved into chaos. Human ships were fighting in ways that violated every principle of space combat. Ramming attacks that should have been suicide runs somehow succeeded through precise coordination, ships deliberately accepting damage to position themselves for devastating counterstrikes, formations that looked suicidal but proved devastatingly effective. "They're improvising, Supreme Commander," his tactical officer replied, his stress patterns showing complete bewilderment. "Their formations keep changing. Every time we adjust to counter their tactics, they shift to something completely different." The battle's turning point came when Commander Shin Ye-jin, leading the human fighter wings, demonstrated why humans were feared throughout the galaxy for their tactical creativity. Instead of engaging Vorthon fighters in traditional dogfights, her squadrons used the system's asteroid belt as both weapon and shield. Rocks accelerated to relativistic speeds became kinetic kill vehicles, while the fighters themselves used the debris field to break up Vorthon formations. But it was Captain Park So-jin who delivered the stroke that broke Vorthon morale. As the enemy fleet struggled to adapt to human tactical chaos, she identified a critical weakness in their formation. The command ship Subjugator's Wrath had positioned itself to coordinate the assault, but remained vulnerable to attack from the system's polar axis. "Admiral," she reported to Choi, "I have a solution to their command structure problem." "Execute it, Captain." Park's plan was audacious even by human standards. Her task force accelerated out of the orbital plane entirely, using the system's star's gravitational cover to approach the Vorthon flagship from an impossible angle. By the time Kralthax realized the threat, human ships were already firing point-blank into his vessel's command sections. The Subjugator's Wrath shuddered. Under the assault, its shields failing as human weapons found every weakness in Vorthon design. Kralthax felt his ship dying around him, bulkheads buckling and atmosphere venting through hull breaches that his damage control teams couldn't seal fast enough. "Supreme Commander," his communications officer shouted over the din of failing systems. "The fleet is requesting orders. Admiral Thex reports 60% casualties in the Vanguard. Admiral Morka's squadron has been completely destroyed." Kralthax stared at his tactical display in growing horror. In 20 minutes of combat, the humans had systematically dismantled formations that had conquered dozens of worlds. His ships were scattered, their coordination broken, their morale shattered by an enemy that fought like no one they had ever encountered. But the true shock came when his intelligence officer intercepted human communications, his translation, matrices working frantically to decode the flood of tactical chatter. What he heard chilled his ichor more than any weapon could. "Fleet Admiral, this is Admiral Moon, reporting from the Outer Rim. We're detecting the engagement on long-range sensors. Request permission to bring the expeditionary force to assist." "Negative, Admiral Moon," came Choi's calm reply. "The home fleet has this situation well in hand. Maintain your positions." "Understood, sir. Standing by with 15,000 vessels, if needed." Kralthax's carapace went rigid with shock. 15,000 more ships? The humans had reserves that dwarfed the entire Vorthon Imperial Navy, and they were casually dismissing them as unnecessary for this engagement. "This isn't their main fleet," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "This is just their home guard." Around him, his bridge crew absorbed the implications. They weren't fighting the human military. They were fighting the equivalent of a local militia. The true scope of human military power remained hidden beyond the edge of known space. A sleeping giant that could deploy fleets larger than most species' entire populations. "Signal the fleet," Kralthax commanded, his voice hollow with defeat. "General retreat. All ships withdraw to hyperspace immediately." But the humans had anticipated even this. Admiral Huang's third battle group had positioned themselves at every viable hyperspace exit point, their weapons trained on fleeing Vorthon vessels. The message was clear. The Vorthons could leave, but only after paying a price for their aggression. As his surviving ships limped toward the system's edge, Kralthax found himself facing a human communication request. Fleet Admiral Choi's weathered face appeared on his screen, showing no triumph or cruelty, only calm professionalism. "Supreme Commander," the human said quietly, "your forces fought bravely, but this system is under human protection now. Any future aggression against the Catherians will be met with our full response." "Full response?" Kralthax croaked, thinking of the 15,000 ships waiting in reserve. Choi's expression didn't change. "Supreme Commander, what you've seen today was us being gentle. I recommend you remember that." The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in chaos. Representatives from 17 major species filled the Great Assembly on Nexus Prime, their various forms of agitation creating a cacophony that the universal translators struggled to process. At the center of it all sat Ambassador Han Sora, humanity's first official representative to the Council, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the pandemonium surrounding her. "The humans deployed 12,000 warships," screeched the Altarian delegate, his crystalline form pulsing with indignant colors. 12,000. For a species they barely knew existed 6 months ago. Councillor Velthara of the Hegemony, her 6 arms gesticulating wildly, added her voice to the chorus. "This represents a fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. No single species has the right to unilaterally intervene in regional conflicts with such overwhelming force." Ambassador Han remained silent, her hands folded calmly as the accusations flew. She had expected this reaction. The footage of the Velthara battle had spread across the galaxy faster than hyperspace news feeds could carry it, and every major power was scrambling to reassess their assumptions about human military capability. "Furthermore," continued the Hegemony representative, "intelligence reports suggest this was merely their home fleet, a defensive force. What does this say about their true military capacity?" The Zenith Collective's insectoid delegate clicked his mandibles in agreement. "Our analysts estimate the humans possess naval assets exceeding 30,000 vessels. This makes them the single largest military force in known space." Murmurs rippled through the assembly as species representatives absorbed the implications. 30,000 ships was larger than the combined fleets of the 3 major galactic powers. Humanity had gone from peripheral species to potential hegemon overnight. Ambassador Han, the council moderator's mechanical voice cut through the noise. "The council requires clarification of human intentions. Was the Velthara intervention an isolated incident, or does it represent a new human policy of military intervention?" Han rose slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the vast chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to diplomatic warfare. "Honored councillors," she began, "humanity intervened at Velthara for a simple reason. The Catherians asked for help. We don't require council authorization to assist our friends, nor do we seek galactic approval for defending innocence from aggression. But the scale," the Altarian delegate protested. "The scale was appropriate to the threat," Han interrupted smoothly. "The Vorthans brought 4,000 ships to destroy a peaceful species. We brought enough to ensure that wouldn't happen, and if another species requests similar assistance," demanded Councillor Velthara. Han's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes seemed to harden. "Then we'll evaluate that request on its merits. If innocents face extinction and ask humanity for help, we'll provide it." The implications sent shockwaves through the assembly. Smaller species began calculating which neighbors might threaten them, while the major powers realized their freedom to intimidate weaker civilizations had suddenly become much more complicated. Meanwhile, in the depths of space beyond the galactic rim, another drama was unfolding. The Vorthon Imperial Council had convened an emergency session aboard the fortress station Dominion's Heart, their deliberations taking place in the harsh red lighting their species preferred. Emperor Kralvex, his ancient carapace bearing the scars of centuries of conquest, listened to Supreme Commander Kralthax's report with growing rage. The destruction of 60% of their war fleet represented not just a military defeat, but an existential threat to the Empire itself. "You retreated," the Emperor stated, his voice carrying harmonics of barely contained fury. "You retreated from inferior numbers of an untested species. They weren't inferior numbers, Imperial Majesty, Kralthax replied, struggling to maintain his composure. 12,000 ships, with 15,000 more held in reserve. Their tactics were unlike anything in our experience. They fight with a coordination and creativity that our models never predicted. Excuses, hissed War Prime Morthek, Kralthax's chief rival. The humans surprised us once. That advantage is gone. We know their capabilities now. Emperor Kralvex's attention shifted to his intelligence chief. What do our allies report? The hegemony has distanced themselves from our expansion, Imperial Majesty. They're claiming the Catherian intervention was an internal matter they cannot support. The consortium is maintaining strict neutrality. Our vassal species are questioning their loyalty obligations. The Emperor's carapace shifted to display patterns of cold calculation. The Vorthan Empire had been built on the principle of inevitable victory, the idea that their military superiority made resistance futile. The humans had shattered that perception in a single afternoon. Summon the Grand Armada, he commanded. Finally. Every ship, every fleet, every vessel capable of void warfare. If the humans want to play the numbers game, we'll show them what a true military empire can field. War Prime Morthek's excitement patterns flared. The entire Grand Armada, Imperial Majesty, that's 8,000 ships from across the Empire. All of them, the Emperor confirmed. We'll crush the human fleet and then burn their homeworld as an example. Let the galaxy see what happens to species that interfere with Vorthan destiny. But even as the orders went out across the Empire, cracks were beginning to show. On the outer worlds, planetary governors received reports of the human intervention with growing unease. If a species could deploy 12,000 ships to defend strangers, what would they do to protect their actual allies? Governor Shanthor of Kelthera Prime called an emergency meeting of his planetary council. The humans have offered amnesty to any Vorthan world that withdraws from Imperial service, he announced to the assembled officials. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, promising protection to any system that declares independence. That's treason, protested General Kexvar, though his stress patterns showed uncertainty rather than conviction. Is it? Shanthor replied. The Empire demands we contribute our remaining fleet elements to this Grand Armada. Our children will crew those ships, sailing to almost certain death against an enemy that destroyed 60% of our best forces in 20 minutes. Perhaps it's time to consider alternatives. Similar conversations were taking place across dozens of Vorthan worlds as governors, generals, and planetary councils grappled with the new reality. The Empire's outer territories had always been held together by fear and the promise of shared conquest. With both pillars crumbling, the entire structure began to shake. On Earth, Director Ryu Taikyung of Human Intelligence stood in the Situation Room beneath Geneva, watching real-time feeds from across Vorthan space. The psychological warfare campaign was proceeding exactly as planned. 17 systems have declared independence in the last 48 hours, reported analyst Kim Dong-hwan. The Vorthans are having to redeploy fleet elements to maintain control of their own territory. And their Grand Armada? Director Ryu asked. Still mobilizing, but at reduced strength. They're having to choose between external offensive capability and internal security. Our projections suggest they'll manage perhaps 6,000 ships for the assault. Admiral Yoon Jae-sung, who had traveled to Earth for strategic consultations, studied the tactical displays with professional interest. 6,000 is still substantial. They'll be coming with everything they have left. Then we'd better be ready with everything we have, Director Ryu replied. Signal Admiral Moon's Expeditionary Force. Time to show the galaxy what human military doctrine really looks like. Back on Velthera Prime, Ambassador Vel stood in the rebuilt council chambers watching human engineers work alongside Catherian technicians to integrate defensive systems. The sight still amazed her. Humans sharing their most advanced military technology with a species they'd met less than a week ago. The humans are preparing for another battle, she observed to Captain Kev, who had been promoted to Admiral in recognition of his coordination with human forces. Admiral Choi believes the Vorthans will return with their remaining fleets, Kev replied. He's asked permission to establish permanent defensive installations in our outer system. Permanent? Vel's stress patterns shifted to confusion. They intend to stay? They intend to keep their promise, corrected a familiar voice. Admiral Lee Tae-ho, recently promoted after his performance in the battle, approached with a data pad containing casualty reports. We told the galaxy that this system is under human protection. That's not a temporary arrangement. Vel studied the human officer's weathered face, seeing something she was only beginning to understand. Your species doesn't make small commitments, does it? Lee's expression softened slightly. Ambassador, when someone asks humanity for help, we don't just show up once and leave. We show up, we solve the problem, and we make sure it stays solved. That's what friends do. The Battle of the Twin Stars began not with the massive fleet engagement everyone expected, but with a single transmission broadcast across every frequency in known space. This is Admiral Lee Tae-ho of the Human Defense Force. His voice carried across the void to 6,000 Vorthon ships and 27,000 human vessels. To the crews of the Vorthon Grand Armada, you have sailed here believing you fight for honor and empire. Your leaders have told you that retreat is impossible, that death in battle is preferable to the shame of surrender. Emperor Kralvex, aboard his flagship Imperial Destiny, listened with growing fury as the human's words reached every ship in his armada. "Cut that transmission," he snarled. "I cannot, Imperial Majesty," his communications officer replied with barely concealed terror. "They're broadcasting on quantum frequencies we cannot jam," Lee's voice continued, calm and measured. "But I offer you a different choice. Any ship that powers down its weapons and requests safe passage will be escorted to the system's edge unharmed. Any crew that wishes asylum will be granted it. This is not your war. This is your Emperor's war. You don't have to die for his pride." The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the Vorthon formation, ship after ship began powering down. Weapon systems, not dozens, hundreds. Entire squadrons that had sailed from the outer territories chose life over glory, sanctuary over sacrifice. Traitors. War Prime Morthek screamed as his tactical display showed red indicators spreading through the armada like a plague. "Open fire on the deserters." But Emperor Kralvex, for all his rage, was no fool. "Belay that order," he commanded. "We need every ship that remains loyal." His carapace shifted to display patterns of cold calculation as he watched his Grand Armada dissolve before the battle even began. In 30 minutes, the Vorthon force had shrunk from 6,000 ships to barely 3,000. Those that remained were the core Imperial fleets, crews whose loyalty was unquestioned and whose hatred of humanity had been forged in the fires of recent defeat. "So be it," Admiral Lee murmured from the bridge of Soul's Pride. "For those who choose to fight, we'll make it quick." The engagement that followed redefined space warfare for every species watching from across the galaxy. Admiral Moon's expeditionary force demonstrated tactics that made the home fleet's improvisation look conservative by comparison. Human ships fought in three-dimensional formations that used gravitational fields as weapons, coordinated strikes across light minutes of space, with precision that seemed supernatural, and employed weapon systems that appeared to violate known physics. Captain Song Mi-young led deep strike squadrons that materialized inside Vorthon formations through micro-wormhole generators, delivering devastating attacks before vanishing again. Admiral An Young-ho coordinated a complex multi-vector assault that fragmented the Imperial fleet into isolated groups, each surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. But the true masterstroke came when the humans revealed they had been studying Vorthon technology during the brief ceasefire. Every weapon frequency, every shield modulation, every tactical protocol had been analyzed and countered. The Vorthons found themselves fighting an enemy that knew their capabilities better than they did. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Vorthon Grand Armada had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Emperor Kralvex's flagship drifted, powerless among the wreckage, its shields down and life support failing. Admiral Lee's face appeared on the Emperor's personal screen, showing neither triumph nor cruelty. "Emperor Kralvex," he said quietly, "your war is over. Your empire is finished. But your species doesn't have to be." The Emperor's mandibles clicked weakly, his ancient carapace bearing fresh scars from the battle. You offer terms to the defeated? Offer mercy to anyone willing to accept it, Lee replied. Surrender your remaining forces. Call for the dissolution of your empire. Help us establish a transition government that can guide your people toward a peaceful future. Do this, and you and your crews will be treated with honor. It was unprecedented in galactic history. The victorious power offering not just mercy but active assistance to rebuild what they had just destroyed. Across the watching galaxy, species representatives struggled to understand human motivations. Emperor Kralvex studied the human admiral's face for long moments, seeing something there that his warrior culture had never taught him to recognize: genuine compassion for a fallen enemy. I accept, he whispered, the words feeling strange in his throat. The formal surrender was broadcast across the galaxy 3 days later. But by then, the real transformation had already begun. Vorthon systems that had declared independence found themselves under human protection, their transition to self-governance supported by teams of human advisors and Catherian diplomats working in unprecedented cooperation. 6 months after the Battle of the Twin Stars, Ambassador Han So-Ra stood before a very different galactic council. The emergency sessions had given way to formal restructuring, with humanity now holding a permanent seat as a founding member of the reformed galactic government. The Human-Catherian Alliance proposes the establishment of a galactic peacekeeping force, she announced to the assembled representatives, a multinational fleet dedicated to preventing the kind of aggression we witnessed from the Vorthon Empire. And who would command this force? Asked the Altarian delegate, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Admiral Yoon Jae-sung has agreed to serve as Supreme Commander, Han replied, under oversight from a joint council representing all member species. The vote was unanimous. The species that had once feared human military power now desperately wanted it on their side. 1 year later on Velthara Prime, Admiral Lee Tae-ho walked through the memorial gardens with Ambassador Vel. The crystalline monuments caught the light of the twin suns, each one representing a life lost in the battle that had changed everything. Your people built this memorial for all the dead, Vel observed, her stress patterns showing deep contemplation. Even the Vorthons who attacked us. Death in battle deserves honor, regardless of the cause they died for, Lee replied. Those soldiers weren't evil. They were loyal to leaders who made evil choices. They paused before the central monument, where the names of fallen humans, Catherians, and Vorthons were inscribed together in 3 languages. At its base, children from all 3 species played together, their laughter echoing through the gardens. I still don't understand your species completely, Vel admitted. When we called for help, we expected a few dozen ships, maybe 100. Lee smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Ambassador, that's the thing about humanity. We don't measure our response by what seems reasonable. We measure it by what's needed. And if the need had been greater, then we would have brought more ships, he said simply. We would have built more ships. We would have done whatever it took. Vel's stress patterns shifted to something approaching awe. Your species doesn't know how to do anything halfway, does it? No, Lee agreed, watching the children play among the monuments to the dead. We really don't. Across the galaxy, a new phrase had entered common usage in a dozen languages, spoken with equal parts wonder and warning. Careful what you ask the humans for, you might get it. But on peaceful worlds like Velthara Prime, in schools and hospitals and diplomatic centers where former enemies now work together, parents told their children a different version of the story. When the darkness comes, when evil threatens everything, you love remember that somewhere in the galaxy are the humans, and if you call for help, they will answer. Not with what they think you need, not with what they can spare, but with everything they have. Because that's what you do when someone needs help. The age of conquest had ended. The age of cooperation had begun. And at its heart stood humanity, the Aida species that had looked at 12,000 warships and asked, is that enough? The galaxy would never be the same.